Hi folks, this is a audio commentary on Barbara London and Jim Stone, a short course in photography, pages 64 to 66. So, had a very good question from somebody today, and that question was, why do we have to learn the F-16 rule, and why do we have to learn how to run an automatic or semi-automatic camera manually by using the F-16 rule? And my explanation is that you don't have to. Just because you're learning this basic exposure theory right now, it doesn't mean that you're going to be saddled with having to adjust everything manually for the rest of your photography career. I'm very competent because of all of my years in photography of running my camera on manual, but 99% of the time I will be running it on either aperture priority or shutter priority. But I understand, and you will understand the workings that are going on inside the camera. You'll understand that if you're looking for shallow depth of field and you go to a bigger lens opening and you're on AV, when you're twisting the control dial and dialing in f3.5, you will understand that the camera program is making the shutter speed go much faster. And in the opposite case, if you're deciding to shoot scenery and you pinch down the aperture pretty small, you'll understand that your shutter speeds are going to go longer and longer. And by doing that kind of understanding, you might say, I've got to go back to the car and get my tripod out of the trunk because I want these shots to be sharp. So these few pages, we're taking them a little bit at a time, but these few pages are designed to build a foundation for you trying to become smarter than your camera. Every time I get a new camera, I have to buy a guidebook and I have to really check it out because the cameras are getting smarter and smarter. If you understand some of this basic exposure theory, it will make you more in charge of your tools. And that's the definition of an artist, is somebody who is not just pressing buttons, but a person who is using a tool in a creative way. So that's why we're doing this. And when you want to, you can always use the F-16 rule, just kind of to refresh your memory and kind of check to make sure that your meters are working properly. But these days, if your camera's working, it's working, and if it's not working, it's not working. So, page number 64. There's one illustration, and that is an exposure meter. There used to be a movement in learning photography that was called the zone system. The zone system was developed by some people up in the West Coast. But Ansel Adams got a hold of it and he perfected it. And so for years and years and years, you would see serious amateur photographers and professional photographers, and they always had a light meter in their hand. And they were not just taking one reading of a scene, but they were monitoring with a light meter, a handheld light meter. They were reading what is the brightest part of the scene, what is the darkest part that I want to keep shadows in, and where is my middle gray. And they would take these readings, and then they would have 3 different sets of f-stops and shutter speeds, and then they would choose one of those, or an intermediary one, to make the exposure with. You can still do that with your DSLR if you set your exposure meter to spot, and then you can just take readings from highlights and shadows and mid-grays, and then you can kind of concoct your own settings from that. So these days, a handheld meter is going to be used by somebody who's probably working an event. And in an event, things happen, and you can't say, hold everything, redo that move, please. So if you're photographing a wedding and the pastor says no flashes in church during the ceremony, it's really comforting to have a handheld meter so that you can get some ideas. The interior of a church is like, there's areas where there are pools of light, and then there's areas that are just dark with shadow. And you can walk around the church and you can see, if the couple is over here, I'm going to need to be about here with my ISO or with my shutter speed. If the couple is over here, I know that I'm going to have to change things because it's much brighter over here. And likewise in a studio, if you're taking commercial food pictures, or you're taking for the catalog industry, if you're taking pictures of clothing and articles that are going to be sold on the internet, you're working in a controlled lighting environment. A handheld meter is going to tell you again where my, I have somebody out there who wants to work with a green screen. It'll help you to make sure that your green screen is evenly lit from one side to the next. You can just keep taking readings and checking and make sure that the light is even. Now that being said, I'm not going to ask you to save your money for a light meter. These are kind of specialty items, and if you were to ever want a light meter, then I would say you should buy a handheld meter that is also a flash meter or a strobe meter. So it will look the same thing as this picture on page 64, and it'll take what are called continuous light readings, which is what your camera is working with, continuous light readings. Or if you decide to invest in 2 or 3 strobe lights and set up a home studio and take portraits, then the meter can become a strobe meter, and it will read the intense blinking of light of the strobes. So I think these days I've priced out strobe meters. They're usually about $150 for a cheap one. They're running up to $300 or $400 for a good one. And save your money, because the good ones are better, and you won't wear them out. They'll be with you for a long time. So okay. So exposure, intensity, and time. I'm going to give you a link to an Adorama TV thing, which is called the exposure triangle, and it's going to help you go through some of these things. Bracketing is really a very important insurance policy, and when I say insurance policy, you should think of two insurance policies. One of them is on the front end of your lens. Do you remember that? What did I say was good insurance to protect your lens from impact? There was a UV filter, and you should have that. That's good insurance for your lens. But bracketing and exposure is good insurance, because when you return to your computer and you're editing and you're trying to prepare things in Snapseed or Photoshop, if you have a series of exposures that are all a little bit different, you'll be able to find one of them, or you'll be able to combine. Later on we're going to learn about HDR, or you'll be able to combine three different exposures into one picture. So if somebody said to me, we need a picture of Mystery Castle, and I don't know if it's still there on South Mountain, I think it is, and I went down there and I took one picture, because I'm so overconfident of myself, and I take one picture and then I drive all the way back home and I load it up in my computer and I realize, oh, that was not the right exposure. Now I have to run back down there. I have to go down there again tomorrow, and I have to take it all over. So bracketing is nothing more than taking 3 shots generally. You start with the, and this is now on page 65, you start with the exposure that your camera gives you. And remember, light meters have this tendency to want to see everything as middle gray. So it said the original exposure is 1/60th of a second at 5.6. Now if you're going to bracket, then you want to shoot maybe 1 stop on each side of that, or 1.5 stops on each side of that. The illustration on page 65 is a 1 stop. So let's go down. It said original exposure 160 at f5.6. So drop down to 1 stop less. You'll notice that the shutter speed stays the same. Do not change both. Leave one of those settings the same. In this case, they're leaving the shutter speed the same in all 3 shots. What they're changing is the size of the lens opening. So 1 stop less exposure, when you go from 5.6 to 8, you're going to a smaller lens opening. So half the amount of light is going to get into the camera, as opposed to 160 at f5.6. Then you have so-called a good exposure, but you don't know for sure. And so you have one stop less than a good exposure, which actually may be the right exposure. And just to be sure, you're going to go one stop more exposure. So look at the shutter speed. It's the same, 1/60. And now the aperture from the original 5.6 is now up to 4. So that will let in twice as much light as 5.6, and so we're going to get more exposure. So maybe 80% of the time the original exposure is the right exposure, and you end up with a properly exposed file, and then you end up with one that's slightly underexposed, and then you end up with one that's slightly overexposed. But you really don't know that unless you're sitting there and you're studying your histograms. I would like you to go to your camera user manual and check to see if you have a feature called automatic exposure bracketing. And if you have that feature, it's really, really nice. It's really a positive thing. And every time you bring the camera up and you compose a picture, you just take 3 pictures. You just go click, click, click. And every time you do that set of 3 pictures, the camera will automatically bracket under and over. And you'll see that in your metadata when you start looking at the back of the camera, and you'll see what were the shutter speeds and what were the f-stops, and you'll see that go click, click, click. And there are even certain menu items on certain cameras where you can just press the shutter release button once and you'll hear 3 pictures being taken in rapid succession, and those are your bracketed ones. So the more important the picture is, the more likely you ought to be bracketing. So take extra SD cards with you, maybe 12 gig cards or 16 gig cards, and take 2 or 3 of those with you and bracket your exposures. So the next page, what I want you to do is kind of study your camera guidebook and look for the exposure override. It's called exposure compensation button, or it may be a menu item, and many times it will look like a plus slash minus, or a minus slash plus. And that's another way, and I know that, I think it was Jeff said that he discovered this exposure compensation. And that's another way of making the picture a little brighter or a little darker. And that's just running by looking at your camera results. You're not even studying your histogram that much, but you're just saying, I think I need this one a little lighter, or I think I need this one a little darker. So exposure compensation dial, if you look down here at the bottom of page 66, excuse me, you will see the -1 and the +1, or the -2 and the +2. Generally speaking, the camera meter is going to be accurate enough that it's not going to give you a reading that's 3 or 4 or 5 stops off. It's going to give you a good reading for what it thinks is 18% gray, middle gray, but then you may have to say, wait a minute, I'm at the snow scene right now, and the snow is looking gray in the picture. I want it to look white in the picture. So then you go to +2 or +1. So that's it for these pages, and I hope that this is making sense to you. And definitely write me questions that come up. So I'll put that link to the Adorama exposure triangle, and you'll get somebody else talking to you too. So hang in there.